Still looking trim and fit, Mr Hartfield? I'll have to have a chat what your secret is, eh? Welcome. I now welcome the officers from Airservices Australia.
The Adonis.
Yeah, sure. Mr Hartfield, do you have an opening statement? If you do, you're going to be very brave.
No, I do not,
Thank
Senator.
You. Thank you. Senator Canavan.
Thank you, Chair. I don't know if you just heard, I was asked questions about landing at regional airports and impacts of cloud cover. There's been twice in Mount Isa that landing has been limited because of 1,900-foot cloud cover, so quite high. Are you aware of, do you collect data on how often this happens across regional airports?
Senator Jason Hartfield, Chief Executive Officer, the data we would collect is where we are providing a control tower service at some of our regional ports. We would definitely have that data.
Right.
At some of what we would call regional ports where there isn't an air traffic control service, it would only be a pilot report that they hadn't been able to arrive.
Well, could you take on notice if you have any reporting or data on that? Now, as I said earlier, I thought years ago the Australian government invested to improve our GPS system with this SPAS program, and I went out to the Canberra airport, provided how we can land now. We'll be able to land at regional airports without a tower, with lower levels of fog or cloud. That still seems very high. So where's that SPAS program up to, and when are we going to see the benefits of that?
Senator, Geoscience Australia would be able to give you the full details of where the program's at. We're working with Geoscience Australia on the aviation component, and with that particular technology, with the augmentation, for be used for aviation purposes sort of requires sort of the extra level of fidelity than what the benefits are for the, and they would be best to provide where that progress is. So we're still working towards it, and it's a major piece for us.
So does that require upgrades to the equipment in the aircraft as well, to take advantage of the SPAS?
Yeah, to utilise the space-based augmentation system, there is a certain level of avionics that's required to access the signal. However, there are also other technologies that we are helping roll out around some of our regional ports that do help lower the or allow for better arrivals in other weather, not just on SPAS.
Maybe if you could take on notice the details of that, because it is a very important issue, obviously, because when this does close, particularly in remote areas, not a lot of alternatives, ways, if there can be life and death situations. So this is an incredibly important initiative. Chair, if you don't mind, Senator Mackenzie could take the rest of my time.
Yep, absolutely.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Mr Hartfield, I had the opportunity to meet with the Brisbane Flight Path Alliance, a community group that's incredibly concerned about noise, specifically in flight paths into the Brisbane airport, directly over their homes. And despite being in this shadow portfolio for a short amount of time, I've had hundreds of individuals email me daily with their concerns. They're concerned that they aren't being listened to, that the culture of Airservices Australia is not one of openness, of consultation, of sitting down with communities and understanding what their issues are. And I just want to understand what Airservices Australia is doing to actually engage with this community and try and solve their issues.
Thank you, Senator. I will pass to Mr Peter Curran shortly to go through the details of the amount of community workshops and also some of our stakeholder engagement that we've been doing over the last 6 months plus, as a result of undertaking the post-implementation review of the flight path changes for the new parallel runway. Cindy, to give you an element of the history to where we've got to here is that when the new runway became operational in the mid-2020, in the height of COVID, the traffic distribution was different to what was originally forecast. To just give you just a brief history, with the border closures that happened with Queensland, the intra-state traffic actually increased, and because of the disposition of the runways, most of it was off.
No, keep
Sorry.
going.
And as a result,
just because I'm going to have to go to this one. I will give you a list of questions that I would like you to answer to Senator Canavan whilst I'm no longer in the room. I want to understand how you're responding to the residents' concern and engaging with them, because the feedback that I'm getting, and I'm sure I'll get a lovely list of stakeholder meetings and blah, 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 but there's a difference between rocking up and lecturing people and actually hearing their concerns, so I want to understand that. You've received a draft report on the post-implementation review. How does that review respond to the concerns of residents affected by the noise, and what options exist to help them address those concerns?
Good.
So if you could give the answers to all those questions, I will be back shortly. Thank you.
Just going
To kick off, Peter Curran.
Do my best to ask follow-ups.
Thank you, Senator. Peter Curran, Airservices Chief Customer Experience and Strategy Officer. With regard to the direct questions of the Senator, Airservices has been conducting a post-implementation review of the change that was implemented in Brisbane in mid-2020. That process is to take a 12-month period after the implementation of the change, so that we have a full set of seasons that we can understand the air transport movements and the way that weather, etc., has impacted. COVID obviously impacted that, as Mr Harfield's already touched on. So then we've gone into the post-implementation review proper since late last year. We did a series of engagements and consultations with community stakeholders as well as industry to understand what the terms of reference for that process should be. We then settled on the terms of reference and commenced the post-implementation review earlier this year. As a part of that process, and to give some greater independence to the process, Airservices engaged an international organisation called Trax International, who do this kind of work in the United Kingdom and also in Europe, to come in and conduct a review of the post-implementation review. That report was finalised, and there was a significant amount of consultation through February and March. I can confirmed that there was more than 15 workshops held in February and March with Trax International and communities across southeast Queensland, focused in and around Brisbane largely, but also out into Sanford and up to northern parts that are impacted, as well as the southern parts of or south of Brisbane River that are impacted by the new parallel runway and the changes to the flight paths. That report was finalised in September. Airservices took on all of the recommendations of that independent recommendation and then produced our post-implementation review report and published that to the community. We provided the community a period of comment, which was approximately 4 weeks. That just closed last week, and we received 440 pieces of individual feedback from community members. We're going through the process of reviewing that to understand that, and then we plan to complete the report with the recommendations that we'll go forward with for implementation in the course of next year and beyond. We plan to release that report this year by the 15th of December is the date that we're targeting at present, and we're very keen to get it done to get the response back to the community. With regards to, I think, the second question of the Senator around what are the types of, perhaps it was the third question in fact, what are the types of changes that we are able to make that will give potentially better noise outcomes to the Brisbane community. There's broadly 4 packages that we are proposing, and that's entirely consistent with the work of the independent company that we engaged to do the review of the work we were doing. The first package is around transparency of our planning and governance and also community engagement. The second package is around trying to maximise over-water flights. The positioning of Brisbane Airport is such that wherever possible, we seek to do a procedure called simultaneous opposite direction parallel runway operations. I'm sorry for the complexity. Essentially, that means we try to land and take off using both runways over the bay. And that obviously is the mode of operation that gives most noise relief to the residents of Brisbane. That is a mode that doesn't allow for really high capacity movement, so it constrains the operation of the airport and the industry. There's a balance to be struck with that, but maximising wherever we can those overwater flights. The third package is around reducing the frequency and concentration of overflight of communities, and that's about looking at multiple flight paths where we might be able to move noise around and better share it across communities. And the final package is around optimising that wider Brisbane airspace, which is potentially looking at a broader review of the way Brisbane airspace and potentially South East Queensland airspace operates. I think they're the 4 packages that we would expect to look to work with communities over the next year or 2 to engage with them. I should say that we need to consult communities throughout the course of next year around the specific location of potential flight path changes. We're not at a point and we can't just go out and move a flight path. We need to go and consult communities about specific changes, and that work we intend to conduct next year.
Okay. Just going back to the packages, what's the difference between 3 and 4? Because it's sort of similar, saying sharing is mentioned under recommendation 4.1 and recommendation 3.1.
Probably broadly goes to scale. We will start all these packages at the same time. It's not that one will start and we won't start 4 and, for a period of time. We can start them all in parallel. It's around the magnitude of the change, and that's typically relates to then how much consultation we need to undertake. An example might be, Senator, that we could look to put 2 flight paths in to allow us to alternate departures off a particular runway, which would move and share noise between 2 communities. That could be done within the broad construct of the way that Brisbane airspace operates today. Right. We hit a point where eventually, though, if you're going to change fundamentally how Brisbane airspace operates, we need to redesign. There's consequential impacts, flows through to the way other airports operate in and around South East Queensland, and flows into things like Amberley airspace. And so at a certain point, we can't make what I'd say small adjustments in package 3, and you need to step back and make a much broader change, and that's what package 4 could potentially involve.
From my experience talking to people there in Brisbane, this sharing issue, is that something similar to what I think Heathrow does with their flight paths? Is that where we're moving towards? Because that's been raised with me multiple times. Why don't we just do what Heathrow does? Yeah,
Senator, certainly that kind of approach is one of the options that we will be considering in more detail through the course of consultation next year. That probably came up because the independent organisation Trax is UK based and has done a lot of work with Heathrow.
It's designed to Heathrow.
They didn't design it, but they certainly engaged in the community consultation and in Gatwick. Those kinds of examples definitely came up. There are certainly options, but there are again impacts on certain communities for the Heathrow operation, and some benefits and some disbenefits to that model. We're not fixed on any particular model at the moment. What we're doing is looking at the potential for noise sharing opportunities and engaging communities on that.
So the flight path that is currently chosen, that's causing all of this angst, and I'm often in Brisbane sometimes for functions, and I tell you what, I'd get pretty angry if I lived in some of the places that I've been, and it just flights over so constantly and you can't talk. Have they been chosen to optimise the costs of the airlines, to minimise their fuel costs, if you like?
Senator, at no stage is there a single metric or a single factor that is taken into the design of flight paths. If you go back to the chronology of the airspace design in Brisbane, started in 2005-06 with a referral to the then minister. There's an MDP that's approved, and Airservices works within that airport. I beg your pardon, MDP, the Master Development Plan. Airservices works within that construct of an approved MDP and designs airspace which enables the approved capacity. And we seek to do that by balancing a range of considerations, including industry efficiency and noise impacts, environmental impacts on community, CO2 more notably becoming a consideration in recent times, not just noise in terms of environmental considerations, there's also areas of natural heritage, etc.
Okay, so with this new model, these new packages, will you still be considering those other factors, the industry efficiency, for example? That'd still be a consideration?
That's right, Senator. It's not a case of simply not considering. Airservices is required to ensure that safety is our primary consideration, as you'd expect, and then we're required to consider environmental impacts and industry as well. Okay.
But, so how do you weigh these up? How is this algorithm, if you like, or formula that you're going to design going to weigh up the costs of imposing noise on certain communities, and particularly significant and repetitive noise, compared to the extra costs of more costly flight paths.
Senator, it's certainly not an algorithm. There are quantitative and qualitative metrics that go into it, and it's never just a single flight path in an environment like a Brisbane or a Melbourne or a Sydney. It is a network of flight paths, and so first and foremost, the network of flight paths that have to be safely separated and managed are designed, and then the potential for understanding the number of dwellings that are overflown, understanding the number of residents that are impacted by that design versus the track miles that are overflown and the CO2, as well as the consultation feedback that we get from both industry and community. And again, it's not just the lateral framing of a flight path, it's also the altitude at which the flight path is operating over a given community or location. So there's a fairly complex range of factors that get balanced. There is no simple algorithm for that kind of assessment. It's a fairly complex process that takes a lengthy period of time by necessity.
And so will one of the factors that be feeding into this trying to minimise carbon emissions?
Senator, track miles and CO2 emissions is a factor, yes.
Okay. So with that being the case, some people are going to get more noise to lower our carbon emissions.
Not necessarily, Senator.
That's the trade-off, right?
Well, the trade-off hasn't been made yet. The design hasn't been.
But there will be a trade-off.
There's a balancing consideration.
And so, if we didn't have the carbon emissions target, people would get less noise over their houses.
We've been factoring in flight path design, flight path track miles, as from an industry efficiency viewpoint, fuel burn viewpoint, and CO2 viewpoint for some years. Okay.
And how long? You mentioned you're going to. Is it a final report out before Christmas?
That's correct,
the draft, the final, and you'll be consulting on implementation next year. I don't know if they were your words, but that's what it took away.
I'd probably like to say implementation and design aspects of implementation, because the report does not say a flight path will be located over this particular community yet. Right. What it talks about is the desire that we've heard through the engagement that we've had with community and industry, that there be, for example, noise sharing outcomes. So
there'll be similar recommendations to what was in the draft, effectively. There might be some I'm not holding any changes, but there'll be a similar sort of level, if you like. They're fairly high level, those recommendations.
I think that's probably a fair characterisation, Senator, yes.
Okay. And so how long will this design and implementation phase take before we've got some alternative routes and relief for people in Brisbane?
We're certainly expecting elements can be done relatively quickly around better use of overwater operations through the course of next year. But the more complex changes will, by necessity, require a series of engagements with community and industry to understand the specific impacts on specific communities for a specific flight path proposal, and that will be a process that will commence next year, but will move into 2024 also, certainly at this stage. Okay,
so the basic principle is if it's over water, you don't have to consult with anyone. The fish don't care. Well, let it say.
No, I couldn't say that. If I could just add to that, right. The notion of it going over water, these flight paths will return back over land at a certain point,
right?
And there has been some concerns raised by some communities around what altitude those flights will return over land, and so it is a consideration.
Right. For my purposes, what sort of altitude? What's your threshold after which you don't really need to consult with communities?
There's not a specific threshold. Above 20,000 feet, historically, we would show that there is generally less concern. It is pretty high. Right. However, there are concerns that get raised and complaints that get raised with their service around visual intrusion, and so we do receive a range of inputs from communities around all aspects of flight as it relates to the environment.
If you live in a city, you're going to see planes. That's life. But okay. But at what threshold? It's just important for us to know what threshold do people start complaining about the noise. There's got to be some kind of reasonableness.
Senator, I'm loath to give an altitude for that because of the the heightened sensitivities that you see in areas. If I can give an example where there are relatively low ambient noise in communities around, say, Brookfield and Sanford, we had originally, when the designs were done some years ago, viewed that would not be a significant issue, and frankly, the communities in those areas have raised concerns around it. So we'd like to put an altitude on it. I think we need to understand all the communities that are impacted by any proposed change.
All right, well, thank you for that. I'm not sure if Senator Mackenzie had further ones. I know she.
Before you do, are we going to get to AMSA today?
Yes, I think. Well, we're not totally in control, but I think it probably won't take long for us to finish these questions, and then we'll go, if that's okay, Chair. But, Rex, okay.
Yeah, look, one of the issues that I got was that your website was open to receive feedback on the draft report, and community members were seeking to give you feedback on that, and yet it seemed to crash around that. Like, did you receive any complaints from community members about not being able to upload their feedback to your draft report on your website?
Senator, I have not received that. I'm not aware of it, and I believe if we had a crash around an issue, we've had the post-implementation
I'm happy to read the email
review open for 4 weeks. It's something that I'm surprised to hear, but you know,
You're surprised to hear.
IT issues can happen from time to time. I'm not aware of it.
I'll cede to Senator Whish-Wilson, but I'll be coming back, and I'm happy to read the email out to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Look, I'll put some more detailed questions to you. I'm clearly not going to have time to ask anything in detail today, but I just want to go through. I've recently had a meeting with you guys and got an update on Launceston Airport and what you're doing there. So I'll just focus on a couple of other airports where I just want to get some information. Starting with Jandakot Airport in Western Australia. There was an article in the West Australian by Claire Sadler and Jacqueline Robson on the 23rd of November that talked about high levels of PFAS contamination in drinking water at Jandakot. Can Airservices confirm that Jandakot Airport is the source of that PFAS contamination? And if not, is there any work going on in regards to that?
Senator, I need to refer that probably to the Department of Infrastructure, as that we have not operated at Jandakot with PFAS, so I'm unaware of Jandakot's particular issues.
You're not responsible for PFAS.
We have not provided an aviation rescue and firefighting service at
So has the department consulted with you at all about Jandakot Airport?
Not to my knowledge.
They haven't raised it with you?
No, they have not.
Would that be unusual given your experience and ongoing issues at other airports?
So we have consultation with and work very closely with the department on what I call the detailed site investigations that we're doing at airports that we're involved in and other federally released, but we don't and so we're sharing information and our experiences, okay. But in regards to Jandakot, we have not had.
So they haven't consulted with you as to their own assessment to investigate the source? They haven't asked for your expertise at all? Okay, no worries. Avalon Airport, there's obviously been a number of articles you're probably familiar with. We had one recently in ABC News and another one for the Geelong Times. Could you give us an update on what's the source of contamination of PFAS at Avalon?
Thank you, Senator. Just sort of slight background is that we identified in the mains drinking water at our fire station at Avalon Airport that it was above the drinking water threshold. We then went and tested our air traffic control tower that we have there and found the elevated levels of PFAS. Okay. So we are downstream and it was in the mains. We understand that from Barwon Water is that the water coming on is PFAS free, so it is somewhere on the airport, and I'm not sure of the direct site. However, in conjunction with Avalon Airport, is that they have started to replace all of those particular pipes, and with our facilities, we did a deep clean and worked through to get it into an appropriate piece. Okay.
In the Geelong Advertiser, in the article by Jacob Grahams, and that was November the 1st, it said that it mentioned Airservices produced reports for 15 of 20 airports where the organisation provides aviation rescue firefighting services. But the report from the Avalon Airport is one of those yet to be published. Is that still the case? Is that?
Yeah, so we're working around the broader aspects of things, but whatever. Sorry, I'll take a step back. We have, since Airservices has operated at Avalon Airport, we have never used foam or PFAS related, and so
You inherited.
He said that. So we will take responsibility for our lease site to make sure that we're not contaminating. And one of the reasons we picked up the heightened threshold with the drinking water at our fire station was the fact that we were doing testing for trade waste and assuring. That broader aspect of the testing at Avalon Airport needs to be referred to the department or the Department of Defence, because it's actually a defence site.
Okay, so the status of the investigation at Avalon Airport, we would go to the Department of Defence to get an update on that. Would that also apply to, I mean, in the ABC article of 31st of October, they said the firefighting union was unaware how long PFAS had been in the water. Have you got an idea of how long it had been in drinking water for?
We've got an indication,
right.
And one of the things that we have done since the issue with PFAS is we've been doing a longitudinal health study of our firefighters that I think started around about the 2007-8 mark and recently. So we have the data of blood samples from our firefighters, and then we went back and had a look to see whether there was a spike at Avalon or where it happened, and it looks like that there was elevated piece in around the 2020 mark. So it's a recent thing. It hasn't been long-standing.
Envisage many more questions?
Because
I know Senator McKenzie said she had some.
Just a couple more, Chair.
I'm going to let AFMA go if we're not going to get to it. It's bad enough. Can someone just indicate to me, please, if we can get to AFMA? AMSA. I'm sorry, AMSA.
I did have questions for them, but I think given others, I'll put them on notice.
I'll seek guidance from the committee. If you want to take the next 10 minutes with Airservices, we'll allow AMSA to depart the building.
Unless we want to go over 1 o'clock, Chair.
No, we're not going over 1 o'clock because I'm going to be in the chamber.
Worth trying.
Yeah, well, that ain't going to happen. So thank you anyway. So I don't know if Mr. Betts is still behind, but I'm going to raise this question. He's gone. I'll write to Mr. Betts. Yeah, the department's gone. Okay, thank you. Right. Senator Wish-Wilson, and I'll come back to Senator McKenzie, then Senator Almond-Payne.
Yep, just a couple of other questions then. Could you tell us a bit more about the? There's also, I've also got an article here about Perth Airport. It's a media release dated 25th of the 11th. So recently, Perth Airport commences legal action on PFAS contamination. What's the legal action in relation to, and how did it get to civil action in the courts where the airport is taking this to court?
Perth's legal action is very similar to the legal action underway in Brisbane, right, and a number of other places, where it's around about the liability of the contamination of the airport in PFAS, and it's one of those things we just have to continue to work through. There, from the perspective of the legal action, there is an element that is that unless action is taken, the statutes of limitations starts to disappear, and so some of this action is about preserving people's rights.
Yeah, because their statement was it was to force clean-up of contamination at the airport estate. So are you in arbitration with them on this at the moment, or is it where's the legal action at?
Continue to discuss it because it's early days. It's the matter of sort of mediation and discussion through the particular issues at this stage.
Right, listen, yeah, I've got more detailed questions, Chair, but I'll put them on notice to give other senators a chance to ask their questions.
Thank you, Senator Bush-Wilson. Senator McKenzie.
Thank you very much. On the 31st of August this year, you advised, and I quote, that Airservices Australia will adopt all recommendations in the recently released Brisbane New Parallel Runway Flight Path Post-Implementation Review. So what budget and resources are required and have been allocated to each of the 4 proposed work packages, and over what time frame?
So I'll ask Mr Curran to provide the detail, but
we are short of time.
Then I'll pass straight to Mr Curran.
Thank you.
Senator, the current planning to stand up a project office over the next will be 2 to 3 years is underway, so I don't have a precise budget number for you at this point in time. We'll be working...
So has that already been stood up, that group?
The project management office we're planning to stand up in the course of next month before Christmas. We're planning to complete the post-implementation review report and publish it not later than the 15th of December.
So how are you going to resource the additional work required to adopt and implement all the recommendations?
So we'll be resourcing that through our normal process of standing up a project and bringing in subject matter expertise.
So how many additional staff?
Not determined yet, but order of magnitude, it would be less than 10, I would think.
Right. I'll have some more questions on notice for that. In terms of the community workshops held in various Brisbane locations between the 10th and 15th of September, some attendees said they only found out about that by word of mouth or from obviously local community action groups. So what official communication promotion mechanisms were used to inform local communities of these workshops?
So there was a range of media used, like local media, local newspaper.
Is there a local newspaper?
Across Brisbane,
so the Courier Mail?
Print. I can't confirm that it was the Courier Mail or not. So there was a number of letterbox drops that were undertaken also throughout Brisbane.
So just maybe on notice, because it doesn't seem we have the detail here today, do we, Mr. Curran?
I've got some detail, but perhaps not sufficient.
No, I don't think so. So I would like to know what marketing, promotion and communication was for those 10th to the 15th of September workshops, because my feedback is unless you knew somebody that was in the know, you didn't know it was on. What budget and resources have been allocated and spent on advertising and promoting the community workshops?
I'll take that on notice.
Do you have that detail?
No, I don't have the number for that, Senator.
It's Senate estimates. We like to know how much you spend on things. So on detail then, I want all ad copies placed in print, radio, TV or digital media channels and how much money was spent on all of those. Is it the case that you only advertise these workshops on your registration-only Engage website?
No, Senator, that's not the case, but I'll take that on notice with the other two questions you've asked me to take on notice.
So in Senate estimates in March last year, you referred to flight path design as your, and I quote, bread and butter. Why did you fail to implement any of the TRAC's recommendation for noise mitigation and abatements when the new airspace was launched on the 12th of July 2020?
So, Senator, is that the TRAC's international report was done post that implementation, and it was looking at what had occurred and what the effects were, and those recommendations that came out of the TRAC's report have been informing our post-implementation review. So it's sort of, the TRAC's report came after the implementation.
And has the TRAC's report changed your views or practice?
Yes, it has.
How?
In the sense that those recommendations were all accepted. So TRACs were brought in as an independent review from our normal way of doing things. They came up with the report that came out with the recommendations from your previous question that said on the 31st of August that we accepted all those recommendations. Mm-hmm. Those recommendations are then fed into the post-implementation review. That post-implementation review's final report will come out on the 15th of December. And so that is...
And it'll be implemented over years.
Yeah, so
yep.
That's the implementation for just Brisbane, but the adoption of the principles that came out are affecting all of our flight path design going forward, whether it's for Western Sydney Airport, Melbourne's new runway, Perth's new runway, etc.
Can I just ask how many complaints your team has received between the 12th of July 2020 and now about the aircraft noise at Brisbane Airport?
Senator, I haven't got the data cut exactly like that, but I can give you a sense of the number.
How have you cut the data?
I have It's a great. It would be in the order, Senator. If I could say, it would be in the order of. I can give it to you by month. Would that be preferable?
Sorry, I
can give it to you by month since July. I just would have to add them up.
2020. Yep, sure. Go for it.
Sorry, Senator, perhaps I misheard the question. Did you say since 2020?
Yes.
Okay.
12th of July 2020.
Yeah, okay, I haven't got it specifically since the 12th of July 2020. It would be in the order of several thousand, and I can provide the specific answer to that question on notice.
Okay, well, I know another Senator, Senator Allman-Payne, has some questions, but I've still got questions for Airservices Australia.
Senator Allman-Payne.
Thank you, Chair. I understand that a document entitled Proposal to Increase Allowable Tailwind at Brisbane Airport Key Messages was published on the Airservices Engage portal in February, but later removed, presumably because it was an internal messaging document that was not intended for publication. Are you familiar with that document?
Senator, I'm aware of that document.
I'm able to table that if necessary, Chair. The document recognises an increase in noise complaints relating to Brisbane Airport since the parallel runway opened in 2020, but it says the future profitability of Australia's major airlines will in part depend on BAC's ability to keep the parallel runway system unconstrained, end quote. It also says, to enable long-term growth at Brisbane Airport Corporation Proprietary Limited must maintain the ability to operate with minimal operational constraints. And thirdly, it says the long-term benefits of Brisbane's parallel runway system will only be realised if operational restrictions such as movement caps and curfews are avoided. Can you confirm that Airservices and BAC will continue to resist calls for movement caps and curfews despite the increasing complaints?
And I will say there's 2 minutes to go before we have to finish.
Senator, Airservices will not be resisting the decision of a cap or a curfew as a matter of government policy, and we will implement government policy.
Has Airservices Australia met with the relevant minister to discuss noise issues at Brisbane Airport?
Senator, in my discussions with the minister, the noise issues have been raised and discussed.
Did Airservices Australia express its opposition to caps and curfews at that meeting?
Senator, that issue did not get raised.
The key messages document says BAC will, quote, manage community and political responses to increased aircraft noise complaints. What form will that management take if not movement caps, flight path changes and curfews?
Senator, could you say the question again? I'm sorry.
The key messages document says BAC will manage community and political responses to increased aircraft noise complaints. My question is, what form will that management take if it doesn't include movement caps, flight path changes and curfews?
Senator, I can't comment on what BAC may or may not do with regard to how they think they might manage those issues.
Sorry, we've got about 20 seconds to go. I will ask that you could put those on notice, please. We have a commitment in the chamber. Thank you very much. Look, that concludes today's hearing. Before I do say that, I have put questions on notice to AMSA. I have asked questions along how much money has been spent of the Australian taxpayers' dollars preparing for estimates, full cost, parking, wages, the whole lot, to have them sit here all day and then go home. I'm just putting you on notice, everyone. I'm putting you on, there's still a cost and I have a right to put those questions and I'm looking forward to the answers. That now concludes today's hearing and thank you very much, Mr Harfield. Assistant Minister Chisholm, thank you so much, and to the department officials today, to my colleagues on the committee, to Hansard Broadcasting and to Jerry and his team at Secretariat. Thank you very much. Okay, sorry about that.